you start at 1660, and you refer to this as the age of commerce. How does this begin, essentially, in terms of like how is the capitalism formed at that point within the context of the United States? And as a subsidiary question, how much of it was contingent upon the sort of colonialism and the imperialism that we had? I sort of feel like this era, compared to my daughter who thinks that she's running a business by selling the clothes that I've bought her on Depop. Thinks she's making money, but she doesn't sort of like realize that the initial thing, like I gave her money in the form of clothes and she's selling it on some level. That's like the way that the capitalism started in this country.
Yeah, so beginnings are tricky. Origins are it's a very tricky subject because any historian can tell you, you deal with one origin and it always points back to the next origin and you keep going back and back and back and you end up at the Big Bang. So I started in 1660, precisely because it foregrounds the issue that you brought up, the centrality of empire to the origins of capitalism in the United States, specifically the British Empire. So the 1660s, coming after the English Civil War, it's a period known as the restoration of the British monarchy following the Civil War. And it's a moment when the British Empire, really for the first time, asserts control over North America, imperial control over North America, and sees the spread of commerce as being what was called then an affair of state, being really central to the British imperial project. And so you see the politics and the economics fuse together, and a spread led by the state, but also merchants, also slave owners who bring African forced labor to the southern United States. You see this political effort to bring together an imperial system that's going to further a certain kind of economic development that's commercial. And in that commercial effort, I think you see the beginnings of capitalism in North America.
How did you find specifically that the British organized, I guess, the colonies or North America more broadly in a way that was most efficient to benefit the capitalists?
Yeah, so actually, probably the leading factor at that time was warfare. So in this period, there's multiple European empires who are competing for territory and seeing commerce as a potential source of imperial wealth, mostly through taxation. And so what the British do is they create essentially a free trading zone within the empire, but one that's militarily protected by the Royal Navy. And so you see state power through violence, through conflict and war making, kind of creating the space necessary for the evolution of what we would think of as something like a free market.
And so walk us through here this is a long period of time, I guess, 1660 to 1860, but it is marked essentially by the same thing, is just the extraction of resources from this country, the sort of commodification of them, and also the sort of I guess parallel commodification of human beings, both as a commodity and as a mechanism in which to drive the commodification of in particular cotton, I guess. Talk about that interplay and how that develops over the course of essentially leading up to the Civil War.
Yeah, so maybe 2 points. So first, the central dynamic in this age of commerce from 1660 to 1860 in the book is really geopolitical. So the way to spread commerce is to spread commercial production, as you said, commodity production across space. That requires colonization. It involves moving people into new territories, and it involves conquering, given the presence of Native American peoples and polities. So the state does that through its war-making powers. But in terms of spreading commerce in this period, slavery and coerced African labor emerges as one of the really most dynamic ways to move commercial production across space. The most valuable commodities, you mentioned cotton, really the era starts with sugar in the British Caribbean, also other commodities like rice or indigo, things of this nature. Those parts of the world, the Caribbean, the southern United States, that they're not places because of climate, because of diseases, they're not places that free migrants will choose to go. And so the coercion through enslavement is really important to moving labor into these regions. And I argue in the book that one of the effects of slavery is not just to produce commodities through coerced labor, but within the imperial system to create a whole series of commercial relationships. So if you're going to have slaves spend their entire time laboring to produce sugar to sell back to Britain, New England becomes a place that grows food, or through the fishing industries can provide subsistence provisions for slave plantations. And so I use Adam Smith, and very familiar Smith's argument about the ways in which commercial relationships, markets can fuel growth, to show there's a division of labor in this period that's very much centered in slavery. And so given that that's the theme, you start with the spread of slavery in the 1660s. It's part of the British Imperial Project, and really what ends the era is the Civil War and the geopolitical question of whether or not slavery is going to be allowed in the Western territories. Right? Can slavery continue to spread? And Lincoln and the Republican Party say no, and at that point, we have the outbreak of the Civil War, and this period ends.
Do you think that American capitalism, to the extent that we're telling the story of capitalism, could it have existed without slavery? I mean, could it have been born without it? I mean, again, it's sort of like this dynamic with my daughter. She very well may go on to sort of, sell the jeans that I got her for, enough money that she can then buy 2 other pieces of clothing and build her clothing empire. But if it wasn't for me buying those jeans in the first place, she would not be able to get this thing started. Could capitalism have worked without that level of exploitation of basically free stuff to begin with? I mean, it's sort of like, I don't know. Could Donald Trump have $1 to his name right now if he didn't get that money from his dad, or however you want?
The math suggests no, since I think if he just put it in an index fund, he would have had more. Right.
But I think the answer to the last question is definitely no. I think the earlier questions are a bit more complicated. I mean, in the abstract, sure. I think we're talking about capitalism. We have to talk about capitalism in the plural. So certainly we know that there can be capitalisms without slave labor. We've had one since the Civil War, in this country. With that said, I mean, go ahead.
But I mean, everything that we had, we got to the point where that slavery, and I don't know, and I guess this is a subsidiary question that I want to ask you. Could we have seen the growth of industrial capitalism that really is the next era that you're talking about without that slavery, even in the North? I mean, wasn't it the ability of generating this labor intensive commodity, ultimately cotton, that you could not have made as profitable and as commodified, I guess, were it not for the fact that we just don't have to pay for the part to really make it on some level.
Yeah, I mean, these are old, important debates in economic history. Some have argued that profits from slavery, directly led to investments in early industrialization. Those arguments, those kind of direct connections, right, haven't held up as well. But I still think a weaker version of the same argument, which you're suggesting, has to be true, in the sense that without slavery, the commercial history of the United States would have been greatly diminished. Would that have meant that capitalism never would have come about? I don't know if I go that far. It's an interesting counterfactual question, but we can definitely look at what did happen and say that slavery was very important to early American economic development. I think that changes over time. I think it's much more important earlier in this period. I think by the time you're in the 1840s and 1850s, you're seeing an industrial capitalism develop in the North, which starts to look different. Now, and then I'll just say one more thing. Slavery is the most awful form of coerced labor, but coerced labor. So even when capitalism doesn't depend on slavery as such, it still oftentimes, depends upon or draws from, coercion of labor. And that's something we have to be mindful of, across periods.
Before we get into this next period, let me just ask you one more question too. How the Louisiana Purchase, and in particular the Haitian Revolution, plays into this. I mean, as a factor in changing the course of capitalism as we head towards this next era.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a very specific point, which is that without the revolution in Haiti, very likely Napoleon doesn't decide to sell Louisiana to the United States, and so that's a very significant. Second, I argue in the book that despite the American Revolution, it's very important, but it's not much of a discontinuity in the book. It's in the middle of the same age as I have it. And that actually what the Louisiana Purchase does for the United States is it means that the United States kind of looks like the 18th century British Empire. Instead of having slave colonies in the Caribbean with an industrial metropole in the north, and then provisioning from Northeast colonial America at the time, instead we have this very thriving plantation complex rooted in cotton that emerges out of Louisiana that's connected commercially to the rise of Chicago, cities like that in the Midwest that focused on grain, that focused on food, that focused on provisions, and then industrialization in the Northeast. So it creates a certain kind of continuity that makes the United States look like other imperial powers in the same era that were dependent upon slave labor.